Hello, I'm John Grom, and welcome to the 52nd Right and Left Discussion Forum. The purpose of our discussion forum is to demonstrate that potentially contentious topics can be discussed in a civilized manner, leading to the discovery of common ground. Today's topic is modern mob rule, or does it contribute anything positive to the formation of a more perfect union? Today's panel, beginning on my left, is Patty Haskins, retired math teacher and current member of the Wadsworth City Council. On her left is Bryan Laubaugh, president of R&B Financial Services. On his left is Dr. Ronald Chamberlin, retired senior research electrochemist. And on his left is Dr. Natalie Sydorenko, educator, writer, and consultant in the field of communications. We will begin with Patty. Patty, it can and surely will be argued, probably here today, that historically mob rule has achieved both positive and negative results for our nation. On balance, would you rather live in a nation where mob rule is not tolerated or one where it's encouraged?
Okay. John, we had discussed earlier the definition of this mob rule, and I think that the word mob is, or may be confusing to listeners and even to us on the panel. I mean, is the mob the group that is coming in and smashing windows and carrying pitchforks and throwing things, or is a mob simply a group of people that are voicing their concerns or objections to a specific?
Yes. When we're talking about modern mob rule, and just let me go ahead and throw this definition
please.
in right now, is that mob rule is the control of a political situation by those outside the conventional or lawful realm. That does not necessarily mean criminal or violent behavior. It means that people are trying to influence policy without going through the legislative process.
Okay, and I think that's where we want to start from that. Yeah. First of all, our Constitution guarantees us all the right to have an opinion and to express that opinion, as long as it does not incite violence. For example, you can't run into a movie theater and yell fire. And that's always the example that's been given, is what you can't do as far as free speech. And I think that's important. If you look back in history, there are so many issues that have been decided by successful protesting and doing so in a nonviolent manner. If we look at the entire civil rights movement, there's been good and there's been bad as far as the protesting, but the majority of it was accomplished through nonviolent protest. And I think that's the positive. Where it becomes negative is where a situation exists and a group decides to become violent or to become nonsensical or to jump to conclusions before listening to all of the facts. And we can take all kinds of examples of this. One of the examples I really felt was a form of mob rule was, I believe it was in 2010 when, before the congressional elections, and all of the seated House people were going and having these town meetings. And I remember watching them on television, and they would start to stand up and explain their position, and they were shouted down, yelled at, and not allowed to express what their views were. And it became by an audience that felt, hey, we don't believe anything you say, and we're not going to listen to you.
And we've got the cameras on us, and we're going to give our opinion over the top of yours.
Exactly. Yeah. And that was, I felt, one of the negative effects of it. We've also seen negative effects when groups do become violent. You can go back to the 60s and look at even at Kent State. While I was definitely not in favor and was totally against the National Guard coming in and covering the campus, if you look at what started that, it was the night before, and there was looting and riots in downtown Kent.
And setting fire to the ROTC building.
They burned the ROTC building down. That was totally, and that had a negative effect, which became compounded by that negative event was compounded with a negative event to counteract it, and it turned into the disaster that we have in present history. I think we need to, the other thing I thought of, and I think this is really important when we talk about mob rule, you can look at the very recent case in Indiana with their Religious Freedom Act. And Governor Pence said that he was not going to change anything. He was going to leave it the way it was. I never quite understood why they needed it anyway. If it matched the federal law, why do we need a new one? But that's beside the point. But a group came out and protested this. But what really made them change their mind was money. And many times, mob rule doesn't change. It's, does this event have an economic effect or a monetary effect? Angie's List came in and said, we're not going to do our $40 million expansion. Walmart came in and said, hey, we don't want to associate with this. They were concerned about the Final Four being there.
Disciples of Christ, the church that I go to in Wadsworth and John goes to, they pulled their national convention for 2016 from Indiana already.
We're ready to do it.
Right.
That's unfortunately what moves people. Not logic, not thought.
This is where the corporate America took part in the mob.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And Bryan, I know that you're just dying to dive into this topic.
It's unfortunate that things have to get to that point.
Yes.
Where a mob, whether it be a cyber mob or actual people in the streets turning violent to change public opinion, I think we have a right to protest in this country. I think people enjoy that right as long as it's within the scope of the law and you're not burning down buildings and you're not driving people out of town on a rail. Peaceful protest is the fabric of this country. I think back of some of these countries that have had protests, Tiananmen Square, where the Chinese people decided that they'd had enough. So I'm all for that, but when it turns into a mob, which I think sort of has a negative connotation to it, I don't think anybody benefits from that. Recently, we have another example where the mob was dead wrong, and the college, Virginia, what's been proven to be a fabricated story, through Rolling Stone magazine. That knee-jerk reaction, that's what I worry about. The knee-jerk reaction of the mob has a tendency to go to extremes.
Patty started her comments by mentioning that we all have the right to our opinion and a right to voice it, but where does civil disobedience fit into all of this?
I guess, I think of this, I have the right to swing my fist until it hits your nose.
Yeah.
And so often people won't listen to what the argument is before they start swinging.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the tolerance level is so low on certain subjects that you can't even talk about it without being labeled a bigot. You're white, you don't know what's going on in a particular community, so you're not even welcome to your opinion. And that's where I think it stifles, this mob mentality stifles real discourse on issues that we really need to be a lot more open and tolerant and listen first before we start lashing out. I find it incredulous that the CEO of Apple, which has stores in some of the most oppressed countries in the world, would get up and start using his bully pulpit for Indiana. Whether I agree or disagree with what they did in Indiana, you have a right to express yourself without having the mob with, might not be with pitchforks and all that stuff coming after you, but to threaten and threaten to pull things and all that kind of stuff. I don't think that really.
So he didn't have the right. to pull his company
Oh,
out.
he has a right to
He
do
has that
whatever
right
he
as well.
he has a right to do
Sure.
whatever he
Yeah.
wants.
But you're just saying it's a bit hypocritical.
But I'm
of
saying
him.
exactly, it's a
And
bit
that was pointed
hypocritical
out.
when he has stores in countries that have far worse human rights violations. He has a store in Russia.
Well, I don't think there's
that,
any doubt that Apple and other corporations were protecting their market
Right.
nationwide.
Right.
Of the
even,
consumer, John, is that what you're saying?
Well,
Protecting their consumer.
well, I think I might not agree with Patty, or I might not agree with Ron or other members of the panel, but he has a right to his opinion. And I don't think I have a right to foment a mob that shuts him down from expressing his opinion. And I think that's the downside, the ugly side of this mob thing, is that no one really gets the opportunity to express the other side in a civil way, like we're trying to do here, without someone being labeled or someone being threatened, that knee-jerk reaction that comes along with it.
Going back to your sort of original question here is, would you rather live in a place that has this or that doesn't? And I'm on the side of those who would rather have it.
Agreed.
Again, it's it's kind of a constitutional right. We have the right of assembly. A lot of countries don't. But it brings up also your question about civil disobedience. How does that fit in? It fits into all of this, I think, very well. Civil disobedience, and I participated in some, I'll tell you about that in a minute. You have the right to do that. You also have the obligation to follow whatever penalties might occur from that. And that happened significantly during the Civil Rights Movement and during Vietnam. During Vietnam, I participated in a very mild form. At that time, your telephone bill had a small tax on it, which went to support the war effort. I had to put in during World War II. Several folks, me included, decided to withhold that from our we just cross it off and wrote a little note. Well, I had two occasions to talk to people about that. One was my company treasurer, because they garnished my wages, and I went over and told why I did that. The second was the bank. They took it out of my bank account, the IRS, that is. I had an opportunity to get on top. Minor thing, 10 or 12 cents a month, something like that. But I felt pretty good about it, and I was willing to pay that, and even pay some sort of fine if I needed to. It meant a lot to me at the time. At the time it did. So I think that's part of that. If you need to be responsible for your actions, and I agree with Bryan that it gets out of hand, and particularly in the days of mass media, Facebook and Twitter and all those, you can start this immediately. and we see many examples of that today. On the other hand, somebody said that the students in America got rid of Lyndon Johnson during Vietnam because of the protests. So.
Natalie, I don't want to blindside you with a question you're not expecting, but I'm going to anyway.
Oh, thanks. After I had already prepared my answer to be in concert with these three fine people. Okay, John, go ahead.
No, because I'm dying to get this on the table.
Okay.
We talked about civil disobedience, and that is based on our obligation to disobey an unjust law.
Yes.
Thoreau talked about it, and Martin Luther King talked about it. But do we have the right to determine in a Republican form of government, we're not a democracy, as an individual, what's just and what's not just?
Wow.
It's a much heavier question than everyone else got, John. I obviously, as an individual, cannot determine absolute justice for all. But here's what I'll say. My children have asked, when my husband and I have discussed history and things that we agree or disagree with, Mommy, why does this law exist? It seems unfair. And I will say, people who are in power make laws. Sometimes it extends to us and we get to make those laws, and sometimes we don't. I'm going to disagree with you for 1 second that we're still a republic. I'm going to say we're an oligarchy now. I'm not sure if we're totally a republic. I'm not sure how much power our votes have. Once corporations were allowed to speak as people, as persons, I think they influenced a lot of control. And of course, I am against that, but I think it works no matter what side of the aisle you're on. I think it's a negative result, as Bryan pointed out with Apple, can sway people to however they want. I mean, corporations have more sway now than any individual or any mob. So, in my opinion, the greatest mobs are the largest corporations who make up the plutocracy, who have now determined our laws and legislation.
I agree.
That aside, I will say that we've explained to our children that sometimes laws are unfair because they're created to benefit the people who are in power and to maintain that power. And my husband and I approve of civil disobedience if a situation is unjust. How could I give an example for that? I don't know if I have an absolute example, but if you know as a human being that another human being is being discriminated against, oppressed, or harmed in any way, I think it's the law of humanity to stand up for that person, and that those laws supersede any governmental laws of whatever the country has. If I would have been switched with my parents, which I've always wanted to be, then I could be 21 in 1969 like they were, and I could have been at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 68 and whatnot. Okay, but I wasn't. I'm here for a reason now. If I would have been on a bus and I had to watch black people walk past me every single time because they weren't allowed to sit where they wanted to, I would have absolutely engaged in civil disobedience. The war in Iraq, we at the University of Akron, a consortium of those of us that were concerned, professors, students, we protested the war. We said, you know, Saddam Hussein did not cause 9/11. This is a false rumor. And has he done horrendous things? Yes. But should we have all of our soldiers and their people killed for this? No. And we protested, and we had negative coverage, and we were put on the CIA watch list, as I'm sure most protesters are. And none of that scares me. I feel like it's necessary. I feel like civil disobedience is necessary, or things wouldn't change. We don't feed people to the lions anymore, and we don't have separate drinking fountains. And there's a reason for that, because people went against laws that were wrong. And how do you know they're unjust, John? I don't have an answer for that, other than your heart and your mind and your soul should tell you that they are. And I guess that's not a very scientific answer. But I think you can look in the face of someone suffering, and you can have that empathy and know that it's not right. And most of what I wanted to say to your original question was covered, but I just wanted to mention two things quickly. One is that it's not just mob mentality shifting policy, it's mob mentality destroying reputations. And I mentioned this before the panel started, but my husband and I were just discussing Duke and all the venom we saw on Twitter and Facebook after they won. They don't deserve to win anything. You know, it was the NCAA, it was basketball, it had nothing to do with lacrosse. But people still feel like Duke is lying, Duke is tarnished because of that rape case that came to be not true. So your reputation, even if it doesn't affect policy, it does affect your enrollment. It does affect what people think of you. It does affect the money that comes in. And secondly, sometimes the mob mentality can lead to policy changes that are good. And what I mean by that is, what happened in Ferguson was terrible. Looting, rioting, fires, absolutely unacceptable. However, yesterday, 8 African Americans got voted, legally voted, onto their city council now. That's 8 black members that weren't there before. Because of...
But they could have been.
But I'm not sure if they would have been had the people not collectively stood up. And I'm not saying the violent people, but there were so many more people that were peacefully protesting than there were people that were starting fires. The media wants to cover the fire starters,
That makes
and
better
not the
TV.
people that are in there every day.
I have, at the risk of sounding arrogant, an answer to the question that I ask you.
Okay.
All right. I think an unjust law is one that's in conflict with our Constitution. And the Jim Crow laws in the South were definitely in conflict with the Constitution of the United States. And that makes them, to me, unjust laws. And I don't know if I'd go as far as Martin Luther King Jr. did when he said we have an obligation to disobey unjust laws. But you're certainly standing on pretty firm ground when you do it, when it's in violation.
Do you think that the Constitution wasn't in violation of itself when it was created?
It absolutely was, but you know,
Okay.
if you do a thorough reading of the Federalist Papers and the history of the Constitutional Convention and all of that, boy, it's really hard to imagine where this country would have been without slavery. the slaves built this country, and economically it was impossible at the time to do what we did to start this nation without free labor. It couldn't happen. But anyway, that's another matter. Let me ask this. We think about mob rule as being, first of all, legal to express your opinion and do everything you can to have influence, but we think about negative things. I think about negative things. I think Ferguson, while there may have been some good results that came out of the whole thing, to try to hang all of that on the white officer was a mistake. I think it was mob rule caused the destruction of George Zimmerman when it was really not necessary. But I think I know the answer from three of you.
George did it to himself.
Yeah, I could not
we're
agree
all
with that
thinking
more.
that. We're all looking
George,
at it.
yes,
No, we don't feel
yes.
sorry for George.
Maybe that's for another day. I think three of you are wrong. But, and I think I know your answer to this, all except Bryan, and I'm not sure. But when you think about the laws that allow unrestricted campaign contributions, isn't that just another kind of mob rule? That a minority,
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
These super PACs are. I mean,
Yeah, because you're putting the, and it all goes back to money sways everything.
yeah.
And not
On
only
both
are they,
sides.
and not only
Absolutely.
are, I'm not saying one side or the other.
Absolutely.
And it's not only that
Obama's
it's,
campaign, his second campaign, was unprecedented in the amount of money
telling
that
you.
they raised.
Yeah.
and it's not
I mean,
that
it was
it's,
unbelievable.
and it's
You got-
not just that
you
it's
got
And the
the
Koch
source-
brothers could own half the world with all the money they
it can be
raised.
anonymous.
The sources of the world.
Right.
and it can be
you know.
anonymous, and there is
Right.
money that is, there's foreign money that is being funneled in through American companies and is given legally to
Right.
these candidates.
I'm very
And-
conflicted about David Koch because he's a strong supporter of PBS.
Yeah.
That's a
Well,
great, that's a good
I mean-
quality about him.
I mean,
See, we're all,
then
we're all
if you have
mixed.
those feelings, then you need to vote for Rand Paul. Now, I don't particularly subscribe to his version, but the way he comes out is that he wants to take Washington back and give it back to the people where it belongs and get all the special interests. No matter what side of the aisle you're on, you have special interests. There are very, very large and powerful lobbies that,
Yes.
everyone likes to say, oh, corporations. Well, I'll say unions then. And someone will say, those evil brothers that give all this money. I'll say George Soros and a variety of other people that just give their dollars.
Most of Hollywood.
Most of Hollywood. What I think, going back to the mob thing, if we would just all just be a little more civil, I don't know that anything really positive. I understand about protesting and getting all that kind of stuff, but the damage that it does to just the overall argument, when all of a sudden you can't express your opinion and you're shouted down in the public square because at the time everyone thinks that's unjust. Can we listen first? I mean, look at the situation this happened with the police officer that shot that black man running away from him.
Yeah.
Obviously, that was terribly wrong, and the full force of the law has to be applied there. There's no excuse.
Yeah.
There's no excuse for that. But they're quickly coming out saying, wait a second, we don't want Ferguson here. We don't want to burn down our town. We're going to make sure that within the scope of the law, the right penalties, and the law will come into play. Can we agree to operate within the law? Do we always have to operate outside of the law? Let's protest. Let's go take to the streets and everything. But the minute you start burning down things, I think you sort of lost your ability to really champion that cause.
What'll
That's what I
happen
really.
in that case. The officer was almost immediately fired and charged with murder.
Well, they first came out with, they first actually published his statement.
Right.
And saying that he, the
Self-defense.
And then the video came out and all that kind of stuff.
then the video came out,
You know?
and that's when
Yeah,
it was
That's
like,
an awful
whoops.
hard thing to deny when you see that.
Well,
once
that's
again,
the
once
point.
again, everyone here has a right for their opinion. But the minute someone starts to label somebody,
Yeah.
a climate change denier, a science denier, a bigot, you know, a homophobe,
A war on whatever.
a war on whatever. I think that just
It's a whole PC thing, really.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think we need to really get away from that. I enjoy listening to these opinions. You know.
In the
But you-
minute or so we got, I wanted to circle back to Patty and see if you can give us some examples of where you thought the mob rule was trying to influence decisions on Wadsworth City Council.
Oh, there was one a few years ago, and actually I wasn't on council at the time. I was there before. There was an ordinance introduced to support the immigration law of Arizona, the state law.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember the council meeting that involved this. There were way more people than that room holds.
My wife and my minister went down there and spoke.
And spoke for most of the speakers were in favor of it. The interesting thing was only a couple of them were actually from Wadsworth. Most of them were from out of, some were from out of state. They were from other
The
communities.
group from Columbus, I think, came up and
Right,
involved with
and
that.
it was this big organization. We're going to try to get local councils to support this law. Now, it did not go through.
This is a law that allowed people suspected of being illegal to be stopped.
And it wasn't, and it really wasn't, they were putting it, I think it was a resolution
Right.
to support, wasn't an ordinance, it was a resolution to support
Right.
Arizona's law, which
And no scope with it.
no scope, nothing to do with it. We didn't understand why it was there. I have seen others when we talked about the stop and go being placed in down on College Street, and there were many people there that spoke in favor of it. Some of them against. That one was civil. I felt. I really did feel it was civil. The immigration one was not.
I never did know how that totally turned out. But wow, this turned out to be a pretty good discussion.
I know, we need an hour. A half an hour is not enough.
Yeah, I know, we needed more. So we'll end with this quote. Well, I'm kind of caught up in guess who said this, but one not only has a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. Martin Luther King Jr. Thank you very much for a great discussion.
Thank you.